This is our first video lesson. I know we already did some Impressionism. I gave you guys that Khan Academy reading, but for those of you who wanted the more detailed Miss Tremblay version, it won't be as entertaining because I won't be falling over things in the front of the classroom, but hopefully I can still capture your attention with some cool Impressionist artwork. All right, so Impressionism started in the 1870s, and most Impressionists used what's called plein air painting. So, plein air painting is painting outside. Um, and there are easels that are specifically made for plein air painting now. Of course, at the time, there really weren't as specialized equipment because people really didn't paint outside with oil paints. They would do watercolor outside. This woman is doing an oil painting, it looks like, outside. But most artists would use watercolor and do like quick sketches, and then they would take those into their studios and they would paint with their oil paint. So they were doing studies outside, but they weren't doing like a full finished piece. So the Impressionists changed that by taking oil painting out of the studio and doing it out of doors. They used a lot of quick, thick brush strokes. Sometimes they would paint with their palette knife, which is like a little triangular shaped piece of equipment, triangular shaped like scoop or almost like a scraper. And they would just smear the oil paint on really thickly with this. I'm totally doing gestures right now that you guys can't see. Sorry about that. And just this really quick, fast way of painting. And they were also interested in light and how the eye perceives things. So, looking at this piece by Monet, you can kind of see where the paint is thick, even though, this is just a photograph of one of his pieces. So all these areas where it's very chunky looking, he probably did that quickly with a palette knife. So these strokes are fairly wide. And he's interested in light, as I said, and how the eye perceives light. So when you look at this particular painting, there is a woman standing here, which is actually his wife, and she is holding this umbrella, and the inside of the umbrella looks green, but the inside wasn't actually green. This is probably a white umbrella. So the light that's bouncing off of the grass and the flowers down here is reflecting up inside this umbrella and turning the inside green. And you can see this on her dress too. There's a yellow patch right here, which is again light that's being reflected off of the yellow down here in the grass. We have blue being reflected from the sky. So Monet in particular was interested in something called cast color, which is color that is reflected off of one object onto another, and you really see it a lot on white objects. So her white dress, this young boy's white suit jacket, and this white umbrella, which no longer look white when we see all this reflected color. And this is also called local color. So it's the same thing, but it means a color that's reflected instead of the actual color of the object. So I asked you guys to think about how the Impressionists were anti-establishment, and at the time we still had this really entrenched artistic establishment where there were people who worked at painting academies were essentially in charge of like who got to show their work in salons and galleries, sort of what was accepted. And the Impressionists, like the realists before them, were very much anti-establishment. So when Monet started showing his work, he had a lot of trouble getting galleries and salons to actually accept his pieces. So he just started setting up his own galleries and salons. He was setting up his own showings, and then other artists started to follow along and do the same thing. And this was happening because of this really fast, thick style of paint, this use of cast color and local color, which artists really didn't do before Monet. It wasn't considered acceptable practice. It's not that they didn't understand it, it just wasn't something that you included in your paintings. And the type of subjects that he chose. So a lot of landscapes, a lot of cityscapes, middle class people going about their kind of leisure activities. So in the country, chillaxing. And this really wasn't something that you painted. So just like with the realists who took on more kind of social inequality and painting people who were sort of on the margins of society, Monet and the other Impressionists really challenged the status quo with what they were painting. To us, it seems like, oh, hey, this is a painting of a woman in a countryside. It's pretty. Why wouldn't you want to paint it? But that really wasn't considered acceptable at the time that Monet was painting. So Monet started off the Impressionist movement with this piece called Impressionism Sunrise. And this piece was actually shown. And it was really after this piece that the struggle became real for Monet, and galleries stopped wanting to show his work. So again, you have this really thick, quick paint. You can almost see him kind of scribbling the paint on really fast. Very loose, very thick brush strokes. So he's really showing the paint. And if you remember from our kind of neoclassical and history paintings, the paint was very smooth. You didn't see the chunks of paint. You didn't see brush strokes. So the Impressionists really changed that. And like I said before, Monet and the other Impressionists were really interested in light. So Monet actually did a whole series of this cathedral, the ruined cathedral, and he did the entire series, the same angle, the same view. This is just a more zoomed in picture, but it's the photograph itself that is cropped, so his actual piece wasn't this zoomed in. They're really all identical, except the color changes. So he was really interested in how color changed throughout the day. So we can see this is maybe like 11, 12 o'clock. The sunlight's really bright. It looks like the sun is almost directly overhead. And then here we've got what looks like later on in the day, maybe close to sunset, and we can tell that by the colors. The red color that's on the cathedral here. And this wasn't something that artists really did before Monet, really studying how the color of light changes throughout the day. As a photographer, it's something that I'm very aware of. We really hammer that into our photography students, which is that colors change throughout the day, so you need to adjust in your camera. But artists were, because they were painters, they weren't having to really think about those adjustments. They were just making them automatically. Whereas Monet is basically turning that on its head and showing how light and color change throughout the day. So some more pictures of the cathedral. So this looks like it could be a little later in the afternoon where our shadows are getting harsher. This looks like it is maybe after the sun has set or close to being after. So we're starting to lose a lot of detail. The sky is darkening. So here's another Monet piece. This is showing the suburban life. So we've got middle class people at their leisure activities, clearly a boating party of some kind. So they're at a lake. We see what looks like towels. There are a lot of boats. People are swimming. And this really wasn't something you showed. You didn't show middle class life up until Monet. So much more lighthearted than our realists. He's really interested more in this everyday life that, you know, your more average middle class member of society is experiencing. And this is Renoir, another Impressionist. His paint, as you can see, is not quite as loose as Monet's. There's more detail, but it's not super, super smooth like we saw with those neoclassical. So again, another boating party. Your middle class folks are enjoying this luncheon. The guys are only wearing these tank tops. The women, of course, are still in these dresses, but they have these more kind of summery bonnets, so it's a little more loose, relaxed. Everybody is clearly having a good time and enjoying themselves. So again, the subject matter here is what tells us that this is Impressionism, and the fact that it's Renoir, who is a very well-known Impressionist painter. So another Impressionist who had very specific subject matter was Edgar Degas. He is known for his paintings of dancers and ballerinas in particular. And Degas was a little different than the other Impressionists because he was influenced by the camera. So photography had started to become more mainstream. Degas actually owned a camera and he took a lot of his own photographs. And you can see the influence of the photograph because of the angle that he's taking this or painting this at. So it's kind of a high up angle. It's a little strange of an angle. And over here you've got people who are cut off and cropped awkwardly. And this sort of slice of the backstage scenery. So she is performing and very posed, but then in the background, you as an audience member probably wouldn't be able to see these young women. So they're talking, they're clearly relaxing behind the set that's here on the stage. So painting ballerinas at the time actually was considered a little bit, I want to say, uncouth, if you know that particular word, which means that it's not classy. So ballerinas were not considered classy, even though going to the ballet was. It was a really popular form of entertainment, and so there were a lot of ballerinas, and it was kind of looked down on. So Degas is sort of building off of the subject matter of realism as well as Impressionism, and again, really using the camera to set up his photos. So you guys grew up being used to iPhones, being used to digital photography where you can go in and you can put filters and you can really curate the type of images that you're showing. I grew up at a time where there were a lot of Polaroid cameras and you would take photos and they would look terrible because you didn't have a lot of time to compose your shots. You were getting much fewer photographs. There were no filters. And so you wound up with these really awkwardly cropped, awkwardly composed photos. And so Degas is working with a camera that's doing the same thing. These kind of awkward, taken very quickly photos. And you can see that in a lot of his paintings, especially the strange angles. And there's another reason that you see a lot of these strange angles, these very steep angles, and that is Japanese prints. So in your reading, you guys saw that Japan had very recently been opened to trade with the outside world. So they'd been a closed off society for several centuries and ended up reopening in the 1800s. And so because of all the trade, there were all these cultural items that came flooding out and of course went flooding into Japan from Europe and the United States. So one of the things that came out was Japanese woodblock prints. So these were prints on paper that were made from carving out a piece of wood and then you'd put ink on and transfer it to paper. And these Japanese prints have a certain style that was very popular at the time, and one of the elements was a very high up angle. So these very steep angles that almost feel like the people would fall off the page. Like you can almost see this figure sliding down like she's standing on an angle. Another element is the mixing of textures. So you have one texture here in her robe, another texture here. And this one doesn't have a ton of textures, but there are others where you will see a lot of different textures. So it can be a little overwhelming to the eye. And then usually a very flat background. So here, you have this tree and then it's just black back here. So kind of similar to those Baroque pieces with the really dark backgrounds, although This one happens to be black, but it could really be any color. But just a background that's very flat with really nothing to very little going on. So another artist at the time who was actually working in the US, so all the artists we've looked at were in Europe, was James Abbott McNeill Whistler. And he had this series called Nocturnes, and they were all painted at night. And this one in particular, when you look at it, it looks almost completely abstract. When you know what's going on, it becomes a little less abstract. So it's fireworks that are being shot over a body of water. So here you can see the short line. This looks like it could be a figure watching these fireworks. You have the actual fireworks going off down here, some smoke low to the ground. This is all smoke, and then the fireworks themselves. So McNeill is sometimes thought of as being an early abstract artist because some of his pieces are they're so abstract if you don't know the context that they can read as being non-figural, meaning there's nothing represented in them. But he was actually painting from life or from things that he had seen. This in particular is one of my favorite pieces of art. It's a little washed out for some reason. This version that I have, there are actually a lot more blues and greens in it, depending on the version that you find online. But the actual piece has more blues and greens. And then last but not least, a female Impressionist artist was Mary Cassatt. And Cassatt was another artist who was really, really heavily influenced by Japanese prints. And this is what I was talking about when I said patterns. So you've got two different floral patterns. This is some sort of dresser and then wallpaper. And then the pattern of this oriental rug is completely different, very geometric. A striped pattern in the dress of this female figure. She's sitting on maybe a cloth, which has yet another pattern, and then this face. So this mixing of patterns is very common. You've got the steep, steep angle of the floor, and then the background does have some detail, but it's still really flat. The only way that you can really tell that this is an object and this is wallpaper is the fact that the colors are a little different. You've got this line here. So a very flattened background. And Cassatt is known for painting images of domestic life, especially of mothers and children. And this is something that you really didn't see a lot of before Cassatt. You didn't really see women's intimate lives. And it was because she was a woman. She had access to women's lives. And it was something that she saw every day. So something that she was surrounded by. So she was painting her experience as a woman in 18th or 19th century society, late 1800s. And that really distinguishes her from our other Impressionist artists. She's not quite as loose. Again, kind of like Renoir, there's more detail here. But her subject matter and her influence are very, very in line with Impressionism. So that's the last slide, and that is Impressionism in a nutshell. And we're going to follow this with a presentation on post-Impressionism.